Good morning, everyone. For those who have not met, I'm Branden, Huldeen, the artistic producer here and the director of New Works. We're so happy to kick off the Deeper Look series this year with one of our favorites, Mark St. Germain. So the discussion today is kind of a Mark St. Germain special, which is taking historic lives, other people's lives, and putting them on stage. So we're going to start with the show whose set we're sitting on right now. But we're going to dive quite a bit into how Mark finds his inspiration, when he, I want to also talk about when you think you're going to write a play about someone, and then you realize to not continue writing a play about someone. But in the case of here of Eddie Jaku, what brought you to his book, The Happiest Man on Earth?
Well, I'm curious first, how many people have seen the play? Oh, okay, so that's more than we
talked
expected.
about it a little bit.
So early in the run. I was actually looking at an article on the internet where somebody mentioned they were reading the book, The Happiest Man on Earth. And considering I'm pretty close to a manic depressive, I wanted to see what the happiest people were like. So I was drawn to the book when I read it. It was an incredible story. He's an incredible man. And I just thought it would be a wonderful show to be able to do it.
So the book, how many of you have read the book or listened to the book? So what I was intrigued by, Mark, when we got your first draft is where you decided to stop in his story.
Oh, right.
How do you decide that? I'd just like to say that I saw one day in rehearsal, I saw your copy of the book, and I could tell where you stopped because the first 100 pages are frayed, you could tell it's gone through them, and the last 100 pages are so quite pristine. So how did you decide where to stop? Because there's so much more story that you weren't able to cover without a sequel or a second act.
Right, we did want to do a second act. It was mainly if we wanted to use the device of him talking for the first time about this. We had to obviously cut it off at a certain point in history. He did address his son's synagogue at some point. So the hardest thing for me with a one-person show is how do you set it up? What reason is that person talking to anybody? And so when we decided it would be good to have him kind of mingle with the audience at the beginning and then start to talk, that everything after that in the book had to come out. And he co-founded the Jewish Heritage Museum, Holocaust Center, they call it in Sydney. And they're actually making now an animatronic Eddie that they've taped him and over and over and over, filmed him, and they're somehow creating this robot that will be able to answer people when they come in and ask a question. So all of that part of his life had to come out. And he worked until they both worked until they were in their late 80s together. And he only died 2 years ago, 101.
So talk about framing devices. How many of you saw Eleanor? Let me do it here. Or Dr. Ruth? How do you have the brilliant idea of setting up Eleanor's framing device?
I thought about a lot of ways of doing it, and I found a reference that she always would go to this cemetery to think in Washington. And I thought, well, that's the way to do it. I mean, if she's in a cemetery, what if she's the ghost in the cemetery? Everybody buys it in 2 seconds and you can move on. And that's always a tough decision how to do it. With Dr. Ruth, it was different, that she was Dr. Ruth and she just looks out and wow, great an audience. I love theater. Well, it was because Ruth loves theater so much. And so she liked that idea of recognizing that people are watching her in the theater.
So when you have something like Eddie's story, obviously there's one text, definitive text, his text about his life.
Right.
going back to Eleanor, how many books, how many articles, how heavy was the suitcase?
Well, years ago, I thought of doing a play about Franklin and she and Winston Churchill over Christmas in the White House. And I couldn't figure out how to make it all work in a one time frame, because Churchill did not convince Roosevelt at that time to join the war effort. So I had done a lot of research there, and then Florida Studio Theater had asked me to do a play about a famous woman in history. And Eleanor always impressed me, and the more I read about her, the more I loved her. And so it was a matter of picking that up. So there were probably about a dozen books, all told. I mean, you get the basic storyline if you read a good biography, and then you kind of look around through the others, kind of cherry pick whatever else is useful or interesting.
And what about Eleanor's life made it more theatrical, interesting to you than, say, writing a play about Franklin?
Franklin was a politician. I don't want to write about a politician. And she was really an anti-politician. She was a humanist. She always fought for the underdog. And she did what I don't think anybody can do these days, just speak her mind and have a consistent platform with her daily newspaper column. She had a radio show. She had no problem disagreeing with Franklin or anybody else. And people respected her.
So what draws you to decide, oh, that's the person whose life I'm going to put on stage? Or what scares you away from someone's life other than being a politician? Because I'm sure people are pitching to you, people all the time, that you should put on stage. What ultimately draws you into someone's life?
I wish people were. It's
you can send around a plate and
I could,
names and
accept the contributions. Right, the last even 10 years or so, I just consciously made a decision that I only wanted to write about people that were worth an hour and a half talking about in a theater. And there aren't a lot of people. If you're hoping to have a positive impact with the information and the life, I'm sure you could do a wonderful 90-minute play on Adolf Hitler. But why? Why do it on someone who doesn't really make us more hopeful about the lives we live and the times we're in? And so that's really the bottom line when I look now to find someone. And I did not anticipate writing another one-person play, because it's really difficult. Not for me so much, but for the actor. When we did Dr. Ruth here, poor Deborah Jo Ruff had a 2-hour script, 2-hour monologue at the beginning, which we then cut down to about 90 minutes or so, maybe a little less. And I swore I wouldn't do it again. And then the idea of doing Eleanor and thinking of Harriet Harris, I thought that's perfect. And she was incredible.
Yeah.
And this story just seemed to me, it's so large, it would have to be done in this way, unless you did a movie of millions and millions of dollars. And I didn't have that money. So.
Well, I'll say that when you approached us with this, when we were talking to you about commissioning you on it, I didn't cheat. I listened to the audiobook while gardening and driving and stuff like that. And I was probably about maybe 30 minutes into it until I was like, absolutely. The moment I heard his story, and just kind of his life, I was like, this is a perfect life to share on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you go through it and you start it's almost like it could be called like the luckiest man on earth. The number of things he goes through, and you touch on most of them.
Not all of them.
But not all of the things that happened to him in and out of concentration camps, and just the luck he had was just so amazing. I think you did such a beautiful job of putting that on the stage, where if someone were to tell you this was a story, and not tell you it's a true story, you think it's the most fabricated Hollywood forced story ever, but it's absolutely true. All the stuff that Eddie went through. What are some, there have to have been some people's lives who were like, I think I want to write a play about this person, and then you didn't.
Oh, I've looked at a lot of
Can you talk,
people.
if you don't want to name names, you don't have to, but reasons why you kind of, you know,
Well,
aborted the
I was
project.
always fascinated with Edgar Allan Poe. And I wanted to write actually a love story about him and his ace, I guess it was, that he fell in love with, and who was only about 14 or 15 years old, and her mother. And the three of them were this strange trio. But ultimately, I said, why? You know, it's curious, it's interesting, but I don't really want to spend 6 months of my life on it. Subject people to it afterwards. So, yeah, they're definitely, and you get to a point with some people that if you start to write a play, the characters either start speaking for themselves or they don't. Because if you feel you're forcing it and it's not coming easily, then it won't work.
So how'd you come across Freud's?
Oh, that's a good question.
That one, Freud's last
The
sentence.
Freud.
Him. Them.
Freud, really, it was the cover of Dr. Armin Nicolai's book. I was at a lecture and they had a bunch of books on display and I saw Freud and C.S. Lewis on the cover of the book and I thought, they have nothing in common. Why are they here? And that immediately, the second thought was, well, that's incredibly dramatic. Put them in a room together, and you have conflict, consistent conflict. So that's what sparked that.
What about, and we're going to get to the other part of what's happened with Freud's in a second, but before I forget, Camping with Henry and Tom.
Oh, well, that's
How,
well, that was easy because I was reading a book on, it was probably Edison, and they talked about how he and Ford would go camping with John Burroughs every summer. And by camping, glamping, you know what they say now. They had tons of servants, their tents were put up for them, they had chefs, and then one year they invited Warren G. Harding. And I thought, who in the world would invite Warren G. Harding anywhere? Why would they take him? And so I started to read the history around it. Ford desperately wanted to be president. And Harding, who I found incredibly sympathetic, the more I read about him, the more I liked him, he did not want to be president. All he wanted to do was, really what he would have loved to have done is left his wife and married the young girl that he impregnated and see the daughter he never saw. So I just thought, well, this is incredible. And it would be really interesting if it was a pressure, if Ford invited him as a way to pressure him into leaving politics or to get him into politics. So that's what happened there.
so how did you, what was the amount of research on that?
That was a lot. It's so long ago, I can't remember, but I probably, at least 3 or 4 books on each of them, you know, and then going from there. But they were so, personality-wise, they were so different. Ford was really idolized Edison. Ford was a really horrible person.
Yes, he was.
Anti-Semitic. But sadly, so was Edison, to a certain degree. I did not bring that up because then there'd be 2 bigots around the campfire. But and he was not nearly as
Here.
as horrible as Ford was. But so yeah, I just thought it would be an interesting trio.
So when you go about writing someone's life, is it a case of kind of everything goes in? Do you kind of throw everything in and edit out? How do you figure out, if you want to take Eddie's life, for example, how do you decide what goes in the stew and what stays out?
Well, at this point, it was just kind of instinct, because I'm always thinking to the time length of it. And our director, Ron Lagomersino, he read the first draft, and he immediately got back and said, well, you have to put this in, and this, and this, and gave me a list of 10 other things. I said, Ron, this is gonna be a 2-hour play, we can't do it. Let's just do it, let's do it. So we did. And the first page count, I'm making it up, let's say it was 47 pages. Then when I handed it in, it was probably about 60, and now it's back to 47 pages again. Because then we started cutting everything. But in Ron's defense, some of the things that he wanted to put in were kept, and I lost some other things. So it was a good exercise to do.
But how do you decide, either in the rehearsal process or beforehand, what stays? How do you kill the darlings, those little side stories, those characters?
Right. And there were a bunch of them with him. The story, yeah, you're right. Sometimes you kill the darlings. There's a wonderful story in there where he was helping pull, when they brought the prisoners to the last camp, the prisoners, it was in an open kind of flatbed on a train. So people were freezing to death constantly. And his job was to pull the dead bodies when they got there off, put them in a cart, and then take them in to be cremated. And he pulled a man out, and all of a sudden the man sat up, and he said, can you give this to my wife? He pulled out a picture. And Eddie said yes, and then tracked the woman down afterwards and said, this was from your husband. He wanted to, say he loved you. And she said, please come to the house. Come to the house for dinner. And her father, once the father saw Eddie was a Jew, just didn't want him in. And Eddie said, we really can't have any friendship here because it would put a rift in between you and your family. So there are a lot of stories like that, but when you get to it, you realize it's slowing you down, just how long it took me to say it. It just slowed the story down. So I had to lose him.
So you normally write about people with incredibly rich, interesting lives. Have you ever had to embellish, add to anyone's life story to help theatricalize it, or maybe a little bit of a twist or a fib?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because I'm always conscious that someone in the audience is going to know 1,000 times more about the person, and they're going to say, well, he wouldn't have said this. And I want to be able to say, well, he would have, because he said X, Y, and Z, and at least have the spirit of what was said.
Which we experienced with Eleanor. So many people came to the show who were fanatics of Eleanor Roosevelt, who could probably give you enough information to write 3 more Eleanor plays.
Right.
We did not realize that Eleanor has has groupies. She has fan clubs.
Yeah.
So people were coming in droves because one, the play was brilliant, and the direction was brilliant, and Harriet. But also people were coming because of Eleanor Roosevelt, which we never anticipated that people would come for her. But there's she has a fan club essentially. Freud's, just because it's a little bit the Sir Anthony Hopkins in the room, the elephant in the room. What was it like? What was that process like, going from 2 people on a stage to now other people and on film, and that opportunity to dive back into their 2 lives?
Well, when the play started to get done a lot, and here in our country, but also around the world, right now there's a revival of the Korean version of Freud's Last Session. And there's one going in Buenos Aires. That's another story. It's incredible. I knew I wanted to go further with it. To make it a movie, you couldn't just have them talking in a room. And Freud and his daughter had a very interesting relationship, and I wanted to put Anna in it. And then Dorothy Burlingham, who was her companion through her whole life. it just started to enlarge itself. And once you take it out of the room and you have it in London on the first day of the war, you know, there's all that going on as well. So I wrote it, and no one was really remotely interested in it, and I put it away. And then through strange coincidences, a friend of my daughter, we had her father to dinner, his father to dinner, who was a producer. And I wasn't going to push myself, but he said, well, have you ever written movies? Well, I have written movies before. That's really how I raised my family, is doing writing movies. That's certainly not plays. Plays couldn't have done that. And so I said, well, I did this one thing from a play that nobody really picked up. He was fascinated with it, gave it to a director. It took about 5 years for it to go bounce around. And no one wanted to make it without a star. And at one point, Christopher Plummer really wanted to do it, and I thought that'd be wonderful. And no studio would touch him. They said, well, he's not a big enough star. So I figured it was really dead in the water, and I got an email from a theater company in California that was doing a production. They asked if they could film it as a film. And I thought, well, why not? You know, it's, at least there'll be a record of it. And the next day I got a call from the director, Anthony Hopkins, had picked up the script, read it, called, said, I want to do it. So that's how that
How great.
happened. So it's been an interesting ride. It's a much different world, as I'm sure a lot of you know.
Before we open up to any questions, I know you said you don't want to write another one-person show. I feel like you probably say that frequently.
Until I find the next. Yeah.
If you were to write another one-person show, is there anyone you have in mind? Anyone whose life?
I really don't. And I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for stumbling on Eddie's book.
So you just need to stay out of bookstores.
I need to stay out of bookstores.
Because you never know the next one will grab you. And Julie and I used to always say when we'd see Mark at the theater carrying a book, we'd always be like, oh, is that the next one? And I saw you one time here with like 3 books at once. I think all in one person.
Oh, probably.
And Julie and I were both like, who's the next? Questions from the audience, from Mr. St. Germain. Yes, right here.
Thank you. You are such a wonderful writer, and I can only imagine the joy you have in researching your characters and your topics. But the world of research is changing dramatically now, and with chat GBT and bot GBT, how is that going to impact on you and your colleagues in terms of the facility of researching and getting the word on the page more quickly?
I don't know if it's going to affect the research so much, because probably research done by a computer, if they prove to be accurate, which
yeah.
Today there's an article in the Times about a
That's what's making
legal
me ask
case
you,
that
right?
he had the robot do all the research, and it was all false. Everything that was quoted in this court case. I think the question is what's going to happen with the creative process.
Yeah.
And I met recently a painter who was using it as an inspiration. He would say, he says, for an example, dog jumps over a fence. Now paint me a picture by Picasso of a dog jumping over the fence. Okay, now paint it as, Norman Rockwell. Paint it as, names 5 different sources. He lines them all up, and then he said, from that, I got an idea of something I wanted to do. So maybe it can help creatively. The question is, can it outright a writer? Oddly enough, one of the Freud producers was fascinated with AI and had it write a scene of Freud and Lewis encountering a hot air balloon. And it was really uninspiring. It was not even funny. It just was leaden. So it's going to get to the point that they can do it well, I'm sure. I don't know, nobody knows what will happen, and no one is governing it as far as the legal rights of whatever is created.
Yeah.
So it's going to be the Wild West, I think.
Question? Yes.
I've seen many of your plays. The first one was not here, was at the YMCA on 64th Street in Manhattan.
Oh, that was Freud.
Freud. And then when I got a house up here, I started coming here and I thought, oh, look at this, this is where that originated. But my favorite play was Dancing Lessons.
Ah.
I first saw the reading the year before and then the production the next year. And I just loved it. Is there anything brewing on that?
I wish I could say there
It's
was.
such a beautiful, it's just a beautiful.
Can you repeat the question?
The play dancing lessons that I did, which is,
Should have been on Broadway.
I'm sorry?
It should have been on Broadway.
Should have gone to Broadway.
Well, I think one of the things that worked against it was, at that time, Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime,
yeah.
about an autistic boy, was on Broadway. I mean, this was obviously very different. I'm fortunate that the play has had a nice life, despite not being in New York. It's been done a lot. And I was thinking until almost a week ago, and I changed my mind, of adapting it as a movie.
It's such
And,
a beautiful.
Then after being in the movie world again for a while, I
It's
said,
not gonna work.
I don't want to go there again, so. But yeah, I was very disappointed. But luckily, it does get done.
It's just so beautiful. Thank
Questions
you.
for this half of the room? Yes.
The Happiest Man in the World was a very, very powerful play, written play and as well as acted. It was a fantastic evening. But I'm wondering, did you consider at all having more time toward the end on how he lived his life as a happiest person? It was mostly about the Holocaust, which
Right.
is such an important message. And as I say, it was so profound. But it almost seemed like the end about his life, toward the end, was not a concentration on that.
Well, we did abbreviate a lot there, and it ties into what Branden asked earlier. If we went into detail about his life, more about how he lived in Australia, what he created with the museum, then all of a sudden he's an experienced public speaker. So we had to arbitrarily pick a time that it was going to stop, at least in the world of the play. So, and when he talks about things that really changed him, it was the birth of his son that pulled him out of the darkness. And there really was nothing else as strong as that. So once we got to that point, it seemed time to stop.
Because it's an 8-hour audiobook. Right. So figure out what 85, 90 minutes of that would be pulled. Yes, right here.
Yeah, actually, there was a review of the book, which actually said the second, I forget, I was looking at the other day, which actually said the part in Australia is all very nice, but not as dramatically
Yeah.
compelling
Yeah.
as the Holocaust. Well, we won't begrudge it, but I think the choice makes sense. So two things. First of all, when you, I forget your name, we said,
Branden.
whatever he says is absolutely true. I mean, the basic facts are true, but when people, Eddie, when people recount dramatic tales, they tend naturally to embellish it. So one wonders, how much of it, his story was embellished. The other question actually is more dramatically, he's not just telling the story, but you have the lights and you have the hiding and and trying to conceal himself.
Right.
And the motion. So how did you work that together with the director and the producer who are, actually somehow, not simply telling and trying to dramatize it, but still keeping that's basically a one-man show.
Well, it's a collaboration.
Right.
I mean, in the script, when I wrote it, I had what I wanted in mind. And so I indicated changes of light, music choices. We didn't use music really at all, or very little. There was an album put out of music written by survivors of the camps that were either music smuggled out or music written afterwards. That's interesting. We didn't do that. But, so I tried to indicate, when you're writing it, you try to keep an eye on the pace of it. You need to shake it up, you need to move it here. I tried hard to put a little humor in. There really wasn't in the book, obviously, but with the audience, you need to give them a break. And then whatever I had, then when Ron staged it, he did some things that I didn't expect. Especially with Kenneth, he's an older man. I never would have thought, when I saw him coming under the table, I said to Ron, "You're gonna kill him." And he said, no, it's fine. So then the next time I come to rehearsal, he's standing on a chair. And I wouldn't do it. And he's doing it. But he's incredibly adaptive, Kenneth, and he's in great shape. He jumps up quicker than I could if I were laying here on the ground. So
We have time for just a few more.
Actually, it was about Kenneth. I was going to say, I couldn't believe how wonderful he was in this role, and I was wondering how involved you got in the choosing of the actor, and also, I can't even imagine anyone else playing it now that I've seen him in it.
yeah, well, the great thing about writing plays as opposed to television and film, you write a TV script or a film, you hand it in, they do what they want with it. You have no say. With plays, because of the Dramatists Guild, you have say in the casting, the directing, and if something words can't be changed. I mean, somebody added once a really early play I did, which was a shorter play, At a Gas on Lover's Leap. Somebody added a second act to it. Wrote a second act, and a friend in California called up and said, "Wasn't that a one-act play?" So they were able to shut it down, because you just can't do that. So Kenneth we were really lucky to get him. Eddie's son, Michael, I sent them, there's a little clip that was put together beautifully with sort of a mini commercial, I guess, with some clips from the play. And I sent it to Eddie's sons, and Michael was very moved. He said he looks like him, he sounded like him. Yeah.
Did you meet with them?
Yeah, they were in Australia, so it's just been Zoom talks. Someday, I hope.
And Kenny's been here before, but it was a process where we had a lot of people submit, and Kenny speaks German, is translating things into German, is a friend of the theater, but also when you see Kenny opposite a picture of Eddie, it feels kismet. It really feels like, well, that's an easy answer right there.
This woman.
Yes, right
Yeah,
here.
just a personal observation. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, and I just lost my mother 3 years ago, my father did. We were not the happiest people on earth. So I just want to say that it permeated my parents' lives, and I'm the oldest of the children of survivors. I think it goes down even to the third generation, so I know that my father's thoughts were, he didn't have to say it, but I knew it, that he was always thinking of his parents, always. My mother repressed a lot, but my father, unlike Eddie, spoke about it. I can't remember a time when I didn't remember, when I didn't hear about my grandparents being, murdered and all the stories. Everyone has a story.
Right.
And I can't understand, you don't have to respond, but I can't understand how Eddie could be the happiest man on earth. That's not true.
He says something, and we eliminated it because it seemed almost too trite in a way. But he said happiness is a choice, and you have to consciously make that choice. And we did take that out just, I think, after the first rehearsal.
But that helps me. That's a very big,
Yeah, I mean, look at
Statement.
the fact stunned me that there were so many people who survived the camps only to kill themselves
Yeah.
afterward. That stunned me. Until you really think about it, and then you understand, how did you want to be in this world that could do such a thing? But Eddie just consciously made that decision.
Thank you.
One last question from me, Mark, just because I want to hear your answer. What would you hope if 50 years from now, 100 years from now, someone writes a one-person play about Mark St. Germain? What would your hopes, caveats, where would you start?
I did write a play about myself. It was done over at the Great Barrington Public Theater, and I wish I never wrote it. It was during COVID, and I always swore
I think I saw it.
I-
I did, what was the name?
Dad.
Yeah, I did see it.
It was about growing up with my father and my
Yeah.
brother and sister and I. And it turned out to be cathartic in a way that I think I understood my father after writing it more than I ever did at all. But I would never have it published. I'd put it away. So, and it would be a boring play. If someone wrote about me, no, it would be a 5-minute play.
The 10 by 10.
Well,